Welcome back to the Champion Forum podcast, where I am on a mission to help others lead, inspire, and win in this life. If you've listened to this show at all, you know that I always recommend that leaders get around other leaders that have been where you want to go. Our guest today is no doubt a leader that has been there. Prior to becoming an author, our guest today was the president and chief executive officer and director of SeaWorld Parks and Entertainment, a $1.4 billion entertainment company with well-known brands such as SeaWorld Parks, Busch Garden Parks, and Discovery Cove. For over a decade, he served as the CEO of Herschend Enterprises, the largest family-owned theme park and entertainment company in the United States, with popular brands such as the Harlem Globetrotters and Dolly Parton's Dollywood theme park and dinner theaters. Before joining them, he spent 20 years in the auto industry in general management and marketing roles, primarily in General Motors, Saturn, and Saab divisions. He served as CEO of Saab Automotive USA from 1996 to 2000. In addition, he was the CEO of Amazon's car selling partner, which was later sold to carsdirect.com in 2001. Currently, he's the non-executive chairman of Orange, which is a nonprofit organization that's dedicated to the development and distribution of student, youth, and next generation curriculum to over 9,000 churches in 40 countries. He's also currently a consultant and speaker on Love Works, crisis leadership lessons, and other leadership topics designed to fit the needs of his audience. That is quite a resume. Joel Manby, welcome to the Champion Forum podcast.
Well, thanks, Jeff. It's so exciting for me to be here. I've looked forward to this. I really appreciate what you're doing out there.
Well, just getting to know your content and the heart behind the book, I'm sure just me reading that resume made you awkward, because you're such a humble guy. And, I love that about your leadership style, which I know we're going to get into, which is why you wrote the book. You're definitely carrying somebody that carries the heart of a servant leader. I should have mentioned in your intro as well, which maybe we'll get into this a little bit as well, but you were also featured on Undercover Boss, so you made the prime time as well.
TV star for 45 minutes.
That's right. As the world watched, right?
Well, we'll get into that, but actually we were so fortuitous in that our program followed the NCAA quarterfinals. So 20 million people viewed that program that week.
Wow.
It was the second highest ranked show other than American Idol. So that's back when American Idol was number one. So we'll, as we walk through our story and kind of why, I know we're going to talk about why I wrote the book. I'll weave in the Undercover Boss piece, because that was a big part of it, actually, just the response of the American public to what they saw in that program.
Yeah, it's interesting. You have that resume that screams change management, that screams, navigating personalities and adversities. And, when we have adversities and challenges, obviously with the right leadership, they see those as opportunities. And you've had an opportunity to fix quite a few things. I mean, look at what happened at Saab, some of the best results that organization has seen, but it wasn't like that when you got there. And I'm sure growing up in Michigan, maybe not, you thought, hey, someday I'm going to be the CEO of a big company. I don't know what that looked like, but could you maybe give us a little journey into, the 5-minute tour of Joel Manby and how he got from small town Michigan to CEO and executive level leadership?
Sure. I'm happy to do that. I'll try to give you the 2 or 3 minute version. Like you said, I grew up in Michigan, and we share a similar context there. Both of our parents were very poor, and my dad, for a while, when his dealership was going out of business, he had a tractor dealership. My mom told me when he passed away that he was making about $50 a week for about a 3-year period. So our family, the Manby family, was living off of roughly $2,500 a year, which, even in the mid 60s is not much money. And it teaches you a lot of things that are positive. I think the thing for me that was a little negative is I didn't want to have that lack of money drive everything in our family. And as I grew up, every fight in our home, or at least tension, my parents didn't really fight, but there was a lot of tension over money, and it was always the lack of. And so I have to admit that what drove my career decisions early on was more about could I provide for my family than necessarily what did I love to do. And maybe what I was the best at. So
Mhm.
I say that for all your listeners who, it's okay, I think, in the beginning, maybe to be driven by those things, but in the end of the day, you have to do what you love. And through a circuitous route, I got there, but it took me maybe longer than most. I went to Albion College in Michigan, bachelor's in economics. I went to Harvard Business School for a master's, which was a great experience, very difficult environment, but great friends that came out of it. Then to make a long story short, I spent 20 years in the auto industry and climbed the ladder of within the General Motors system, and really was one of the first four marketing people in Saturn, which was a startup brand, and it was a no hassle, no haggle concept that was very unique at the time. A lot of lessons there for startups and how to break through a really crowded industry, but we differentiate ourselves based on the sales experience in the dealership, not the car itself. And we are actually the first brand to ever differentiate itself based on the experience within the auto
Wow.
industry. But because of the success of Saturn, my big break professionally was because of the success of Saturn. Saab specifically wanted a Saturn person.
Hmm.
And Saab had a wonderful car, but pretty lousy distribution and marketing. Saturn had a pretty marginal car, but incredible distribution and incredible marketing. So at only 35 years old, I was able to run Saab North America, and we did have a wonderful turnaround there for a lot of reasons.
Yeah.
But I think that the educational point for your listeners is through all that 20-year period, I learned a lot more about what wasn't right about leadership than what was right about leadership. And I
That's good.
had this angst in my soul that I knew there had to be a better way to lead. I did not see it modeled in the auto industry. The auto industry was very autocratic, very fear-based. And yet, as a believer myself, I knew that my faith had to be represented in what I did at work, and yet I didn't feel that it was. And all I can explain it as a huge angst. I was searching for something, searching for better leadership, searching to work in a better organization. And it wasn't until the big moment of, frankly, if we had more time, through failure, in a sense, the dot-com startup with Amazon got caught up in the dot-com implosion, and we were really forced to sell because we didn't have enough cash. Our competitors raised their money before the crash. But yet, because of that situation, I was open to going to Herschend Entertainment. I was on their board already, but Jack Herschend, the founder, asked me to come in the company as chairman. And this was definitely a God thing for those who are believers. I know some are and some aren't, but for me, it was definitely a miracle that I even went to this company. But it was at Herschend Entertainment in the theme park business where I learned servant leadership.
Hmm.
And it was through that education from the Herschends that I saw it modeled, Jeff. And once I saw it modeled and I saw that it got tremendous financial results, but also was the way I wanted to lead, that it drove the rest of my life. So it was kind of 20 years doing it the wrong way and
Yeah.
learning, and then 20 years of being exposed to servant leadership in the theme park industry. And then, from Herschend, I was there for almost 15 years. I was recruited away to go to SeaWorld. That was a very difficult turnaround, but very successful in a lot of ways. And I had the Herschend's blessing in doing so. But for your listeners, from a broad perspective, I think it was that I was modeled the way I always intuitively felt leadership should be.
Hmm.
And the rest is really history from the 20 years ago that I met Jack and Pete Herschend.
Wow. That's quite a journey. And, I think about, and we shared offline a little bit about, my upbringing and my journey as well. I didn't quite make it to the CEO level, but there's time left, right, Joel? But they,
Careful what you wish for.
yeah, exactly. Exactly. I made it to a place that I didn't dream I would make. I will say that. And it takes a lot of effort. And, as a young boy growing up in poverty, I never thought that I would be a senior leader at a Fortune 500 company. And so what about you, Joel? What, did you aspire to become a CEO? Were you like, this is the path I'm taking, I'm going to go get this MBA at Harvard and we're going to make a run at the CEO level? Or did it evolve?
Honestly, it evolved. I never set out with that specific goal in mind. And I think if you're an entrepreneur, which I was, I had a very entrepreneurial spirit. You kind of end up running things just because of the way you're wired. But I never set out to be a CEO. I always set out to work really hard. I'm very competitive. I'm very, very hardworking. And when I was in any situation I was in, I wanted to do a really good job for those I worked for and with. And so honestly, it wasn't an aspiration. And I would recommend, or at least advise, try to guard against that. I think the big decision for most young leaders is, do you want to go out and do something on your own, which is fraught with its own set of difficulties, or do you want to work in a bigger team environment of a corporation,
Mm-hmm.
which I found myself. I've always had really good leadership instincts. Even I was always the captain of the football team, or I always tended to be the play caller in whatever I did. And so I loved organizational environment. I loved leading large teams, and almost didn't want to do the startup where it was just me and one other person. But that's just me. I think for your listeners, I would aspire to do the best you can, but I would shy away from setting strict monetary goals or position goals, because those can lead you to make the wrong decisions, I think.
So we've all that, and that's great feedback. We've all heard the saying, don't seek the title or the money, seek to make impact. And
Right.
those things come. And after 20 years at the CEO level and being on this journey, you would concur with that.
I would definitely concur with that. I was very fortunate to get the CEO job so young, and once I had one, I continued to get other opportunities. But I definitely agree with that saying. Have impact, do a great job. The rest will take care of itself.
Yeah. Yeah. Seek to make a difference is
Right.
great advice. And yeah, I do want to talk because you talked a lot about in the intro, your heart of servant leadership and how people shaped you into that, and how, even your faith led you down that way. And obviously there's a big need for that in corporate America, in business in general. And sometimes this servant leadership gets a bad rap, but I know you're passionate about it, so much so that you wrote a book called Love Works. And to talk more about that and how you can weave in this, love of leadership and love of people and still have some success. So what prompted you? At some point you said, I want to get this message out. This might be a gap. This might be a miss for leaders. And you want to encourage, leaders and organizations to adopt this. What prompted you to write the book?
Well, it ties back to our introductory comment about Undercover Boss. Basically, when I got to Herschend, as I said, I had this huge angst that I frankly thought it was just me. I thought I was the one that thought leadership could be better, that we should demand more from leaders, and that going to work should be more fun than it had been for me. When I saw the Herschends and how they led that theme park company, I knew that was the answer. But what happened is as they acquired other companies. We had 12 other properties. The other 11 did not feel like Silver Dollar City in Branson, Missouri, where the Herschends were. It's because they had not defined their culture. They had not put a vernacular to it. It was just because of them. It was person driven or personality driven, and that's not sustainable. There has to be a process and system behind it, which I didn't know at the time. But what happened, Jeff, to answer your question, is when we were on Undercover Boss and those 20 million people saw that program and they saw what an amazing culture Herschend had, we were just inundated. My phone exploded after that program was
I
over.
bet.
And we had thousands of requests for help us get a culture like this, or I want to work for a company like that. And so because of that, I decided to write the book Love Works. And Love Works is really it's just a beginner's course in servant leadership of one of the, I think, 5 steps that has to happen in creating a great servant culture. I wrote the book because I wanted other leaders that had the same angst that I had in that first 20 years in the auto industry that we've already talked about. I wanted to alleviate that angst. I wanted to show people that servant leadership, it does work. It
Mhm.
isn't soft like people think it is, and it
Mhm.
actually gets tremendous results. I mean, I've led both ways. I've led in the autocratic, non-servant leadership world for 20 years, and one of the most dog-eat-dog industries I think on earth, the auto industry. And I've led with servant leadership in environments of servant leadership, and I've led those environments. I can tell you it's more satisfying. It actually gets better financial results if that's a goal, but it also it's a harder way to lead, but it's a better way to lead. And
Yeah.
I think I'm one of the few that has had so much experience on both sides of the coin.
I definitely see it shifting, which is very, appealing, hopefully, to other people that haven't jumped on, the servant leadership model and leading with love. And I think the reason that there's still some people holding out is because they do see it as soft. They
Right.
see it as too fluffy. Like, that's not for the workplace, that's for Sunday morning church or around the dinner table. You can't bring too much of that, into the workplace, because you're going to get taken advantage of. And
Right.
that's what I've heard a lot is, if you go too far in servant leadership, people are going to take advantage of you. So what have you experienced with that, Joel? And how would you say to the leader that's contemplating or working through this in their leadership style, how do they strike the balance between leading with love and that challenging leadership that holds people accountable?
Yeah, it's a great question, Jeff. And it's a multi-pronged answer. And excuse me if I don't, this is going to take more than a minute to get through, but I think it's really important. I think there's several reasons why it doesn't have more traction, that meaning servant leadership. One is what we've talked about, that it isn't modeled very much. Or I agree with you, it's growing. And I think the millennial generation, the younger generation, is demanding it, and they're demanding a more socially conscious organization, which includes how it treats its employees. So I do think that's a good trend, but many people have not seen it modeled, just like I had not. The second point, though, we haven't talked about, it's a definition issue. And I go into this in great detail in the book. If people want to pick it up, it's on Amazon or on my website. But in a nutshell, it's a language problem, because people think of love as we define it in the English language. And as you probably know, the Greeks actually have 4 different words for love that we only have one word for. And eros is their romantic love. But the Greeks also have philos for brotherly love. They have storge for family love, but they also have agape, which is a verb. It's an unconditional love. It has nothing to do with how you feel about somebody. It's not feeling soft, or it is acting a certain way towards people, which basically respect and dignity and trust and truthfulness. It is a verb in how we behave. And I think when people get over that language barrier, then they can understand what the kind of love we're talking about. And the third point I'd make is, if we, I don't know, we'll have the time to go through the 7 words, but a couple of the 7 words, being kind, is not being nice all the time. It's being a motivator. It's giving people positive results, or positive reinforcement.
Yeah.
Being truthful is one of the words. That's very hard. And it's one of the things I find most leaders aren't. They're not
Mm.
truthful to their employees. They're not truthful with themselves. Or trusting is another word. Micromanaging is epidemic, and most leaders don't trust their people to actually make the decisions they're supposed to be making.
Yeah.
And so all these factors that make up leading with love are actually very difficult to do well. So it's a
Yeah.
modeling issue, it's a language issue, and it's the fact that leading with love can be very, very difficult at times.
Yeah. And the good news, I think, for people listening is it can be learned. You don't have to be born with it. It can be learned. It can be adopted. And as a leader, quite frankly, you're responsible for that. You're responsible for the change in the culture in the organization. I did want to touch on the 7 principles. And obviously, for the sake of the podcast, I know we can't go into all 7, but you outline these in the book very, very well, and they've guided you in building amazing cultures. So whether you agree with what Joel is saying, which, by the way, I'm in full agreement with, or not, if you are only results driven, look no further than Joel's results. Like, if that's your motivation, this stuff works. But you outline these 7 principles in the book, Joel, and you've had great success with these 7 principles. if someone's listening to this right now and they're part of a poor culture and they're trying to build a great one, they're taking over a fixer upper, if you will, or a team that's underperforming. And they're like, you know what? I'm going to try this. I've tried everything else. This is what we're going to do. Where do they start first? What would be the place to start?
Yeah, I want to clarify to answer your question. Those 7 words are the 7 words of agape love that we paraphrase actually from 1 Corinthians 13 because it was about agape love. But I am not suggesting in the book that those are the only 7 words to use or the only possible way to define a loving servant leadership culture. But I do think the first step to answer your question is it is critical, no matter where you are in your culture evolution, to define the culture very specifically. And I know that sounds so obvious, but so many times people, when you ask them what their culture really is, it's in very loose terms, terms that aren't defined very well. And when we had those 7 words of love, it wasn't just 7 words. We had 3 to 4 specific behaviors per word. So we literally had 28 different behaviors that we would teach people. Just like you said, it can be taught how to behave. For instance, under patience, it was one of the definitions was praise in public, admonish in private. You don't take people to the woodshed in front of their peers. It just never goes well. And it usually causes people to leave the organization and never quite recover. There's a way to do it, and there's a way to do it that still builds people's dignity. And so the first step is to define it. There are really quickly the other steps. You also have to teach it. You have to measure it. Most people don't measure values. They put a plaque up on the wall and they think people are going to get it. They don't. They have to be taught. It has to be measured. It has to be reviewed consistently and rewarded constantly, meaning people who get promoted, they aren't just hitting the financial numbers, they're hitting the culture numbers.
Yeah.
In 90% of the organizations, according to Gallup and according to my own experience, they don't do those other steps. They put a plaque up on the wall, and then all most leaders do, including me when I was in the auto industry, is talk about the financial results, finance.
Right.
And they don't talk about the people scores and the culture scores. So I went way beyond the first step that people should take, but I want your listeners to understand it's a process. It's not just a set of words.
Yeah. And very worthwhile, by the way, because not only does it provide great results in my experience, but it also it provides lasting leadership legacy. You know, it's amazing, you know, as you're speaking about this, I'm thinking about a phone call that I took yesterday, Joel. I've been I spent 23 years with the same company, and I've been gone since December of 2019 to pursue my dream and passion of doing what I'm doing now. And I got a call last night from a former employee from that company that wanted advice. And they said, man, you know, I just think about the way that you led and the impact that you left. And I thought, man, I was just having one of these moments about my career that I thought, man, I really would love to know what Jeff would do in this situation. And, you know, we can create these cultures that, yes, they drive great results. But at the end of the day, leadership is about helping people reach their fullest potential. And what a better way to do that than to love people. And you can challenge and love at the same time. We see this modeled out for those of us that have children. If you truly care about somebody, you will hold them accountable. And so it doesn't have to be this or that. It can be this and that when it comes to love, right?
I love that example. I'm glad you brought it up because again, it's back to a language barrier, a misperception that love is always nice or always supportive. Look, I've had to let a lot of people go in my life, and not a single time was it easy. And not a single time did I not take part of the blame. And it eats your heart out, it eats your gut out. But they always ended up in a better place. And I've kept in touch with most of them. And you're right. The great leaders, the best leaders you've had, the best teachers, the best coaches are people that confronted you on something, made you better. It didn't feel good at the time, but that's leading with love. It includes truthfulness and also being a trustworthy leader. So I agree with you 100%.
You don't have to just be fluffy and soft, right?
Matter of fact, yeah, it's very little about it is fluffy and soft. It's interesting the way we're wired as human beings, and every research study I've done inside a company, outside a company, the employee surveys, the most common thing, Jeff, that is people score their leaders worse on is positive reinforcement, just stuff that is free. Have you had an accolade in the last week? Are you clear what your job is? Do you feel your leader cares about you? Those are typically ranked very low with leaders, and it doesn't cost anything but time and energy. But most of us are so focused on our own situation
So
that it's
true.
tough to transition. In fact, for me, the biggest transition I made as a leader, and was sometime in my mid 30s, early 40s, even when I switched from worrying about my own career development to realizing what you just said is if I make other people better and stronger, I can delegate more, I can keep better people because they'll stay and work for me or with me. It's a huge transition that a lot of leaders don't make, or they make too late.
It's well said. And, you saying that the biggest impact we can make as a leader usually costs nothing. So Joel, speaking
Yep.
speaking of culture and speaking of the things that don't cost any money, there's really two stories that come from your time at Herschend that I wanted to talk about. And the first one, it might be a little more obvious, and that's the one with Jack Herschend. I saw you mentioned once in an article, a letter that Jack wrote that had a big, profound impact on you. Maybe tell the audience who Jack is and how that letter impacted you as a person, and how you use that experience and what we can take away as leaders as well.
Well, I'm going to answer your question very specifically, but I also want to leave your listeners with a principle behind it. Jack was the founder, CEO, and chairman of Herschend for 40 years before he asked me to take over the chairman role for him when he retired. But Jack was a huge believer in handwritten notes. And we were in the middle of the recession of 2000, 2007, 2008, and it was a really tough time. And we were trying to work our way out of that really tough financial situation, up against some debt covenants, et cetera. And he wrote me a letter right at the right time that I really needed to hear. But what was so impactful is that he didn't actually write it to me, he wrote it to my family.
Hmm.
And he wrote it to my wife and my 4 kids and
Wow.
said to them basically, uh, that Joel's doing a great job. He's leading through a very difficult conversations and difficult period for our company. And I am so grateful that you chose to share him with our company. And it had such an impact on our family. In fact, at the time, I was actually being recruited to take over Six Flags out of bankruptcy, and with huge dollars attached, huge stock options, all the money I ever dreamed of making. But that note had such a profound impact on me and my family that we decided not even to talk to Six Flags folks about it, that we wanted to
Wow.
stay where we were. And the principle, though, behind it is the power of a handwritten note and the power of thinking about how other people feel. Jack spends the first 20 minutes of every day thinking about yesterday. And before he gets to his cell phone and his email and his, getting caught up in the day to day, he thinks about what he saw yesterday and what can he reinforce. And he'll write 3 to 4 letters a day. You think about that, that's 1,000 a year. Over 40 years, he's written well over 40,000 letters. And those letters are like gold. And the principle is just taking time to think about what's going well, reinforce people for what's going well. And it doesn't just make the day of those people, it helps your day start better. And it's so easy for me, at least, to go down the dark hole of everything that's wrong, but it just lifts your spirit to do that. It's a very powerful principle. It's not difficult, but it's difficult to do. And
Wow.
I'm glad you asked the story about
That's
that.
impactful. That's
It's
impactful. Because here's what's so impactful about that. You're now a mature leader when you receive this letter.
right. I was
You have,
CEO.
yeah, you're the CEO.
Yeah.
You have the scars to prove it, right?
Right.
And nobody is excused from this impact, because oftentimes we find you've been here a while, you have the title, they'll be fine. They're fine. They're not fine. Everybody needs that reinforcement. And what you said about having the big money opportunity with Six Flags, we've all heard the saying that people don't quit for the money, they quit their boss.
Right.
Here
Typically.
we have that live and in play where we stayed for the boss. We didn't leave for the money.
Yep.
And so this has impact. And I'm sure it was more than the letter, but obviously the letter had impact as well. But there was a second employee that also had some impact on you while you were there. And the second was Judy Ward. And you go on to say that Judy was an executive assistant. And,
Yep.
and I like that you mention of this, in your writings, because I believe that it's a fresh reminder that everyone's responsible for a healthy culture.
Right.
What can we learn from Judy Ward and how she applied the 7 words into her daily interactions?
God, it's funny. For some reason, you asking that question made me very emotional. Because I know Judy's struggling some with her health, and her husband passed away recently, but
Sorry to hear that.
she's this assistant. So many people think their title kind of influences how much they can have influence on the culture, and nothing can be farther from the truth. Judy took it upon herself to be the culture advocate for Dollywood. There was a general manager at Dollywood named Ken Bell at the time, and he promoted this, but Judy would know who was sick, and she would put out emails that she was praying for these people or ask others to pray for them if they were praying types. She would make sure that Ken was aware of people issues. She just cared a lot about people. And the main point for your listeners is it doesn't matter where you are in the organization, you can have an impact on the culture. And it's a cop-out, I think, to say, well, my leaders don't believe in it, so I'm not going to try to be different. Now, having said that, I will also share a principle that I think at some point, if you want to lead in the organization or your leaders don't get it and they don't support servant leadership and you're frustrated, there will come a time that you may have to leave. And I would support that. I think, frankly, I stayed at SeaWorld a little too long because part of the board was so dysfunctional and unhealthy that it affected me. But I think for your listeners, they can have an impact like Judy Ward, but there also may be a time when they have to leave, depending on the circumstance.
Yes. I had a great Judy Ward around me for many, many years as well. Karen Underwood, if you're ever listening to this episode, you know how much I love and appreciate you. But it is amazing how when you are in a good culture, like you're talking about, what you were able to build with your team and Judy and Jack, and from the top down, we experience this in great cultures. And nobody's excused from these 7 words that you outline in this book. And when people get that feeling that everybody is responsible, I think it changes everything.
It does, and it comes at risk too. Let's face it. In today's world, to put on an email that anyone who wants to pray for this lady, pray for him. Most lawyers or all lawyers would say, don't do that. It's,
Right.
you can't push. Well, we weren't pushing religion. If people wanted to pray, they prayed. If they didn't want to pray, and the people had to approve whether their health situation was talked about because of HIPAA rules. I mean, we followed all the legal rules, but we pressed it because it was important to the culture that people knew we cared about them. And if they didn't want others to know they had cancer, we didn't say it. We just said they need your prayers or what have you. But it was just a wonderful, wonderful, caring culture.
Everybody plays a part. I have one more question, then maybe we'll go into a little bit of a speed round. But I do want to touch on Undercover Boss, if that's all right, just for a minute. In watching this episode, you had some amazing experiences with your employees, and you could tell that you really reflected on these experiences and how they play out as a leader. And I mean, what a great experience to literally go undercover and see what things look like. But you said 2 things that really stood out to me that I'd like your feedback on, that I think the listener can maybe capture something from. And this is a little off script, but the one thing that you said that I've heard you talk about quite a bit is the enthusiasm of our guests, how they feel about our parks won't rise any higher than the enthusiasm of our employees. And
Yep.
Can you take a minute and talk about that? Because many of the listeners, they're in customer service, they have customers. And when I read this or heard it for the first time, I thought, man, it's impactful. It's almost like that John Maxwell's law of the lid kind of philosophy. How did you incorporate that into your culture?
It is one of the most powerful leadership principles I've ever heard. It was actually taught to me by my Harvard classmate, who Joe Kennedy, who went on to run Pandora, the internet radio company, and he basically taught me the level of your guest experience can never rise any higher than the level of enthusiasm of your own employees, and it makes so much sense. But you go out in the everyday world today, especially post-COVID, you go into these organizations, the service is horrific right now, partly because they can't find enough people, and the people they do have, I don't know, seem to have lost their kind of manners. But I think people don't understand the basics, that how you are treated as a person, you're going to turn around and treat others the same way for the most part. So the way we incorporated that is we measured, first of all, we hired friendly people, but we measured our leadership impact. Our frontline employees could tell us how we were treating them, and our 7 words of love that are detailed in Love Works, we were measured on those. So we had to be kind and reinforcing and patient, and that created a culture where they could turn around and do the same for their employees. Another way to say it is marketing is showing your customer what you're about, but culture building is sharing with your employees what you're about.
That's
And
good, Joel.
that is building your
Can you
culture.
say that again?
Well, marketing is teaching your customers what you're about, what your company is about. But culture building is teaching your own employees what you're about. And they both have to happen constantly, and they both have to be consistently done. And most companies, most leaders focus on marketing, and they focus on financial results. Most leaders don't focus on culture building and people results. That's just my own experience. I'm not trying to
Yeah,
be judgmental, but I've
sure.
been around the block a few times. I've seen a lot of companies. I've been on a lot of boards, profit and not for profit, and there is a dearth of great leaders who really understand culture building, because it's not, like I said earlier, it's not words on a plaque.
It's well said. Well said. The second thing you said as a result of being on Undercover Boss, and I'm sure it's a philosophy that you've carried that stood out to me as well, simple but profound. You said your job as a leader is to be the champion of your employees,
Mhm.
ensuring their well-being, removing obstacles that might be in their way, helping them being more productive. The word champion stood out. That's the name of our show, the Champion Forum. But
Right.
how do we get better? How were you a champion for the employees? How did you indoctrinate that into the leadership culture versus leading with the whip and being the champion? Almost like I'm here to serve you and be your champion. How do we get that done?
Yeah, I tell you, first of all, Jeff, it starts with your basic philosophy of human beings. For whatever reason, some people just don't trust other human beings. They think they're always trying to be taken advantage of. And I think it's just how we're brought up. It might be a childhood experience that scarred us, but some leaders trust human beings and some leaders don't seem to. And I've always, and Jack certainly taught me this as well, I start with trusting people and I make them disprove me, and it allows me to delegate more and give more power to the employees, because then I can lead larger and larger organizations that way without micromanaging. But it is just so important of how you think about people. We at Herschend, actually, we went way ahead of our time. At that point, we had a living wage. If you worked for us for 3 years, you basically had to call it, at that time, $35,000-$40,000 a year, which was way above what a theme park worker would typically make. But we wanted low turnover. We wanted our customers to know our employees to know who our customers were, our season pass holders. And yes, we had higher labor costs than our competitors, but we had equal returns to our competitors because we invested a little less in capital and more in our people. And our margins, although slightly less, our overall return was much higher or equal. And we have all the numbers to prove it, because we wanted our employees to love coming to work and to treat our customers as a very important people. So it's a philosophy, and it did pay for itself. But unfortunately, with public companies on Wall Street, you're always measured just on, all right, do you have the lower labor costs? Well, that's not necessarily the goal.
Right.
You might want low turnover, which isn't going to come with the lowest labor cost. So you get the drill. I think it takes strong leadership to overcome the influence of Wall Street, and you got to have some time to build the right monetary success story.
Well said. Well said. And I absolutely agree. And not everybody gets that, and not everybody does that well. And Joel, I'm sure you would agree. I mean, you don't get to the CEO level by ignoring the P&L, right? It is important, but there's so many other factors.
We had to prove to our board, even at Herschend and private company, that we had financial metrics that were comparable to all of our competitors. We had to, or I'd lose my job. And at SeaWorld, the same thing. And we did get the financial results at SeaWorld. It took 3 years, but we got there. But it's not easy, and you have to have the right board and leadership to support you. And I will admit, it was easier at Herschend with private ownership of really smart, caring people like the Herschends versus a public company board at SeaWorld that had a few rat finks in it that were not really the best of people, that didn't really care about other people. And when that happens, it makes it a tougher fight, to be honest.
Yeah. 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 We all have our battles we have to try to win, right?
Yes, exactly.
Well, I don't want to keep too much more of your time, Joe, but I have two more questions for you that I'm hoping you could shed some light to the leaders that are listening, maybe even more so those that are aspire to lead. The first one I wanted to ask you was more on how to manage time. Clearly, in your career, you've had more to do in a day than time to do it. And as is the case with most productive leaders, what advice do you have for leaders on how to separate critical from important?
Yeah, it's a great question. First of all, be aware that it's true for everybody. Everybody in leadership feels that way. So that overwhelmed feeling of having more to do than you can possibly get done is not you alone. That's obvious, but important to know. There are two things I thought about every day when I went to work, literally every day as a CEO. The first question I asked myself is, what are the things that only I can do as the CEO today, or this week, or this month? And that helped separate the wheat from the chaff. So whatever role you're in an organization, whether it's CEO or not, right? You as senior leader of your church, or in your role, what are the things that only you can do? And that's where you should focus. The other thing, second point I make, is try to focus on the important but not urgent things, because they tend to not get done. You can usually delegate the important and urgent things, not always, but typically. But the third thing I'll say, and it's a question I was taught by Nelson Schwab, who was the chairman of Herschend. Every situation you're in, I would ask, all right, what is the worst case scenario that can happen in this situation, and can I live with it? And if it's something I could live with, I would delegate it. And 99% of the things that cross our plate, the worst case scenario is really not that horrible. It's
Right.
fixable. But if it involved losing a key employee, losing a key customer, going bankrupt, taking on too much debt that we couldn't stomach in a downturn, those are decisions that I focus my time and energy on. And at SeaWorld, there were so many things going wrong and so many attacks against us that I had to start every day. And I still work 20 hours a day, 7 days a week, and it almost killed me. But if I hadn't gone through that exercise, it would have killed me.
Yeah. Then comes burnout, then comes resentment, then comes all of these things. And we talk a lot on this show, Joel, about time management and separating, and what's important and what can you do differently, and who else can do it, and what are your HPAs, your high performing activities, like you talked about. What can I do that no one else can do? I would tell you, if you take nothing out of the time management piece there, take that. What is the thing that only I can do, and that I'm skilled to do as well, that's going to move the needle the most? And you'll probably find that it's not a whole lot of things, and you could release so much more. My last question for you, Joel, and this has been outstanding. What mistake have you made that others could learn from? What mistake have you made that you want other leaders to know about and to learn from?
I'm going to stretch it into two things. The first is what you hit on earlier, is I was a workaholic, and I think it was driven by a dad who worked all the time and didn't ever have enough. And I definitely said it was for my family, but in the end of the day, I think it was to cover up my own wounds of childhood. I think the only
Yep.
way I felt valuable was to work all the time.
Yeah.
It ended up costing me, unfortunately, my first marriage, which one of the biggest regret, and still to this day. I mean, I'm in a wonderful second marriage, but the fact that my first one didn't make it still stings me. I still get choked up about it. Sorry. Don't know where that came from. And I think the second thing is to always be honest. Always be honest. There's such a fear of failure of someone that's wired like me or like you. And when we screw up, if I had been completely honest right away and just dealt with it, the situations that I really got in trouble, either professionally or personally, were because I didn't always be completely 100% honest right up front. It cost me dearly. And so I would say to people, it's not cliche. The truth is always the best answer. That hiding or sugarcoating the truth in any way, shape, or form will only come back to haunt you. And I have learned very painfully that that's the truth. So sorry about the emotion there, but
no, it's real.
It is just comes from nowhere sometimes.
The climb to success comes at a price.
Yeah, there's no
and
doubt.
I talk about this a lot in keynotes that I do. And, we talked about this offline, Joel, and leaders need to hear this. There is a price to pay to win and to succeed. And you don't have to do it maybe the way Joel did it, or maybe the way I did it, which at times, and I'm not proud to say it, was, just outwork everybody else. And you mask that in, I'm doing it for the family, and I'm doing it for the kids. And, meanwhile, your whole balance is out of whack.
Right.
And you said it earlier, whenever I jokingly said, I still have time left to be a CEO. Here's some dirty truth. I really don't want to be one. I want to make world-changing impact, no doubt about it. But I also, even though I didn't get to the CEO level, I know the cost of getting to where I did go. And be careful what you ask for. We talked about that employee that called me last night, and he was former employee, and he said, I want to know if you think I'm qualified to do the job. And I said, I have no interest in talking about whether you're qualified. I want to know, do you know what it means to do that job? Because you think you want the job, and you think you want the W-2, and you think you want the title and all the benefits, but do you know what that means? Has anybody talked to you about that? And so I think what you just said there, Joel, is profound. And we can learn a lot from people that have been where we want to go. And some of that is what not to do. And so I appreciate your transparency, and I appreciate your vulnerability. What haven't I asked that I should have, or that you would like our audience to know?
I appreciate it. I think it's been a phenomenal interview. You are really skilled at what you do. I have to say, it was a lot of fun. They're not always fun for me. I would just encourage people, if they've resonated with anything in this talk, to check out the book. It's on Amazon, or audio version. And also I have a website, joelmanby.com, that I'm going to continue to publish. I want to do a second book about those 5 steps of culture transformation that we started getting into, because it's more than just the 7 words. There's a whole process behind it, but that's more to come down the road. But you've done a great job. I've really enjoyed it, and keep doing what you're doing. It's very important.
I definitely intend to, and there's no doubt our listeners got a lot of value out of this as well. So Joel, thank you for your time. As far as the listeners go, everything that Joel just mentioned to you, you can find those in the show notes on the website, jeffhancher.com/show notes. As always, we appreciate you listening today. From the spoken words of Joel Manby, let's be challenged to lead well and be the champion of our teams. Until next week, never forget, you all have been set up to be champions in this life.